Let me start with something that might make you uncomfortable, but that you need to hear. What if I told you that many of the things you're chasing so hard today won't actually give you the peace you're looking for? Think about it. I'm not talking about theories. I'm talking about someone who already lived through all of it. The book of Ecclesiastes is not just a reflection. It's the testimony of someone who reached the end of the road before you did. And now I want to speak to you as if we were alone, without distractions. Because what comes next is not just another story. It's a conversation that can change the way you see your life. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in front of Solomon, a man with unlimited wealth, with unmatched wisdom, with absolute power. And yet, there came a moment when he looked at everything he had built and felt something that maybe you've felt too: emptiness. Not a superficial emptiness, but a deep one, hard to explain. That moment when you ask yourself, is this all there is? And the most striking part is that this feeling doesn't appear when you lack something. Many times it appears when you have everything. That's why the preacher keeps repeating a phrase throughout the book: vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Ecclesiastes 1-2. But now in this second part, the reflection goes even deeper, because it's no longer just about observing life, but about understanding how to live it correctly. Let me ask you something very direct. Are you really living, or just going through the days? Because there's a big difference. You can wake up every morning, do your tasks, fulfill responsibilities, and still feel like something is missing. Like a piece doesn't fit. And this is where the message of Ecclesiastes begins to touch something deep inside, because the problem is not only what you do, it's why you do it. The preacher began to notice that many people live trapped in a routine without a clear direction. They run, but don't know where they're going. They accumulate, but don't know for what. They search, but don't know what for. And that creates a silent, but constant feeling: dissatisfaction. And here's something important I want you to understand from the beginning. The Bible doesn't speak to confuse you. It speaks to awaken you. That's why another verse says, "Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom." Psalm 90:12. It's not about living more years. It's about living with meaning. And that is the question that will guide this conversation. What makes a life truly worth it? Because the preacher began to discover that it's not enough to just exist. You have to understand the purpose. And when he started to go deeper into this, he reached a conclusion that can completely change the way you see the time you have. But before getting there is something you need to recognize within yourself. Something you may have been avoiding. I want you to be completely honest with yourself for a moment. No filters. No quick answers. Do you feel truly satisfied with the life you are living right now? I'm not talking about occasional moments of happiness. I'm talking about something deeper. That feeling that shows up when you're in silence, when nothing is distracting you. The preacher in Ecclesiastes noticed something that is still true today. The human heart is never fully satisfied by external things. He expressed it very clearly. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Ecclesiastes 1:8. Think about it. We always want to see more, know more, have more. It's like there's a constant search, but no rest. And here's where I want to speak to you directly. Maybe you don't call it emptiness. Maybe you call it stress, exhaustion, lack of motivation, or just routine. But deep down, many times it's the same thing. A feeling that something is missing. The preacher understood this very well. And instead of ignoring it, he chose to face it. Because ignoring that feeling doesn't make it disappear. It only hides it. That's why another passage says, "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world yet loses his soul?" Matthew 16:26. Pause on that question. You can achieve many things. You can grow, move forward, reach goals. But if inside you still feel that emptiness, then something important is out of place. And this is where the conversation becomes more personal. Because the problem is not only what you lack, it's what you are using to try to fill it. Many people try to fill that space with more work, more entertainment, more money, more recognition. But the preacher discovered something essential. None of that is enough on its own. And not because those things are bad, but because they were never meant to be the center of your life. Let me ask you something that can change your perspective. When was the last time you truly stopped to think about the direction of your life? Not the urgent, not the immediate, but the important. Because time keeps moving, whether you notice it or not. And every day that passes is a day that doesn't come back. The preacher began to understand this very clearly, and that led him to observe something that affects everyone: the rhythm of life, and how often we live without realizing where we're going. And when he began to analyze this, what he discovered can make you rethink many decisions you currently take for granted. Let me ask you a question that seems simple, but it isn't. Who is setting the pace of your life? Think about it carefully. Is it you, or everything around you? Because many people live constantly reacting to obligations, to expectations, to pressure, to what they are supposed to do, and without realizing it, they stop making intentional choices. The preacher in Ecclesiastes noticed this pattern. Busy people, people running, people striving, but without a clear direction. And that creates a life full of activity, but empty of purpose. That's why he wrote something that is still deeply relevant. Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. Ecclesiastes 5:10. It's like a race with no finish line. It always feels like something more is missing. And here I want to speak to you clearly. It's not wrong to move forward, it's not wrong to improve, it's not wrong to want to grow. The problem begins when all of that becomes the center of your life, because then you start living pushed, not guided. And that is exhausting. Maybe you've already felt it. That sense of being busy all the time, but not necessarily at peace. The preacher saw it too, and that's why he came to a reflection that can change how you live each day. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 4:6. Pause on that image. One handful with rest, or two handfuls with anxiety. The difference is not only in what you have, but in how you live it. Now I want you to ask yourself something very personal. Is your life full, but at peace? Or full, but exhausted? Because there is a big difference between having a lot and living well. And this is where the message begins to go deeper, because it's not just about changing what you do, but transforming what guides your decisions. The preacher began to understand that the real problem is not outside. It is inside the human heart, in what we value, in what we prioritize, in what we pursue. And when he began to analyze that, he realized something many people overlook: the importance of learning to enjoy what God has already given before constantly chasing what is missing. And this completely changes your perspective. I want us to pause here for a moment, because what I'm about to tell you is simple, but it can change the way you live every day. Do you know one of the biggest mistakes we make? Thinking that happiness is always in what we don't yet have. When I achieve this, when I get that, when I reach that point, and without realizing it, we let the present slip away. The preacher in Ecclesiastes came to a very clear conclusion after observing life carefully. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own labor. Ecclesiastes 2:24. This is not an invitation to live superficially. It's an invitation to learn to value what you already have. Because many times we are so focused on what's missing that we fail to enjoy what is already here. Let me ask you something very direct. When was the last time you truly felt grateful for what you have right now? Not automatically, but consciously. The air you breathe, the people around you, the opportunities you have. The preacher understood something very important here, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. Ecclesiastes 3:13. It's a gift, not something guaranteed, not something automatic, a gift. And when you begin to see life from that perspective, something changes inside you. You stop living from anxiety and begin to live from gratitude. But here's something even deeper. Because it's not enough to enjoy the present, you also need to understand who sustains your life. Because if everything depends only on you, the burden becomes too heavy. The preacher understood this when he said, "I know that everything God does will endure forever." Ecclesiastes 3:14. In other words, what God establishes has stability. What depends only on human effort constantly changes. And here I want to speak to you honestly. Many people live trying to control absolutely everything: the future, the outcomes, the circumstances. But that creates anxiety, because there are too many things that don't depend on us. That's why the Bible also reminds us, commit to the Lord whatever you do, and He will establish your plans. Proverbs 16:3. It's not about stopping action. It's about stopping carrying everything on your own. And when the preacher began to understand this, he realized something many people overlook: the difference between living with control and living with trust in God. And that difference changes everything. Now I want to talk to you about something that might make you uncomfortable, but can also set you free: control. Many people believe that in order to have peace, they need to have everything under control. Their life, their decisions, their future, even the people around them. But let me tell you something clearly. That's impossible. And the sooner you understand it, the sooner you'll find rest. The preacher in Ecclesiastes saw this clearly as he observed life. Whoever watches the wind will not plant. Whoever looks at the clouds will not reap. Ecclesiastes 11:4. In other words, if you wait for everything to be perfect before acting, you will never move forward. Because life is never completely controllable. There will always be uncertainty. There will always be change. There will always be things you don't understand. And this is where a key truth comes in. You don't need to control everything to live in peace. You need to trust. That's why the Bible also says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." Proverbs 3:5. It doesn't mean stop thinking. It means stop depending only on yourself. And I know this is not easy, because trusting means letting go. And letting go is scary. But living trying to control everything is exhausting. And let me say something to you, very honestly. If this message is speaking to you, if you feel something inside you is being stirred, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Because sometimes the right message at the right time can bring clarity, direction, even peace. And you don't want to miss what could help you keep moving forward. When the preacher understood that he couldn't control everything, he began to see life from a different perspective. A lighter perspective, but also a deeper one. And that led him to discover something many people forget in the middle of daily chaos: the importance of sowing well, even when you don't immediately see results. I want you to think about something very important. Everything you do today is planting something for tomorrow. Every decision, every word, every habit, nothing is neutral. The preacher in Ecclesiastes understood this when he said, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days you will find it again." Ecclesiastes 11:1. At first glance it may sound like a strange phrase, but it carries a deep meaning. It's about sowing, even when you don't see immediate results. Because many times we want quick answers, visible results, immediate rewards. But life doesn't work that way. There are processes, there are seasons, there are things that are invisible at first but are growing. Let me ask you something. Are you sowing well, even if you're not yet seeing the results? Because it's easy to do the right thing when everything is going well. But the real challenge appears when you don't see results. When you pray, and nothing seems to change. When you do what's right, and no one notices. When you give, and don't receive. That's where many people stop. But the preacher invites us to keep going. Invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8. You do not know what disaster may come upon the land. Ecclesiastes 11:2. It's a call to live with generosity and with vision, not to limit yourself only to what is immediate, because what you do today may have an impact later even if you don't see it. And here I want to speak to you honestly. We live in a culture that wants everything fast, trust, consistency. Now let me ask you something very direct. Are you willing to keep doing what is right, even when you don't see results? Because that is where a life of purpose is built. And when the preacher began to understand this, his perspective changed. He stopped focusing only on the immediate and began to see life with a broader vision. And that led him to discover something many people forget in the middle of routine: the importance of living with intention, not just reacting to what happens. I want you to pause for a second and think about this. How many things do you do on autopilot every day? You wake up, fulfill responsibilities, reply to messages, make quick decisions, and when the day ends, you barely remember how it went. That's living on autopilot. And the preacher in Ecclesiastes understood that a life like this can be full of activity, but lacking depth. That's why he left a very practical teaching. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Ecclesiastes 9:10. He's not just talking about working harder. He's talking about living with intention, doing things with purpose, with awareness, with presence. Because there's a big difference between doing something and doing it with meaning. Let me ask you something very personal. Are you present in your own life, or just passing through it? Because you can be physically in one place, but mentally somewhere else, with people, but distracted, doing things, but without real connection. And little by little, that empties the experience of living. That's why another passage reminds us, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise but as wise, making the most of every opportunity. Ephesians 5:15-16. Making the most of your time doesn't mean filling it with tasks. It means giving it value. It means choosing wisely where you invest your energy, your attention, your heart. And here's something key. Not everything that takes your time deserves your time. Think about it. Some things bring you closer to purpose, and others only distract you. Some decisions build, and others just take up space. And the preacher began to understand that living well is not about doing more, but about doing what truly matters. Now I want to leave you with a question that can change your day. If today were a day that truly matters, what would you do differently? Because the truth is, it does matter. And when you begin to live with that awareness, your way of acting changes, your priorities change, your way of seeing life changes. And that is exactly what began to happen to the preacher. Because as he went deeper into all this, he came to realize something many people overlook, that it's not only how you live that matters, but also how you speak and how you decide. And that has a much greater impact than you might imagine. Now I want you to pay very close attention to this, because not only what you do defines your life, but also what you say, and even more, what you decide. The preacher in Ecclesiastes understood that words carry great weight. They can build, or they can destroy. They can bring you closer to truth, or take you away from it. That's why he gave a very clear warning. Do not be quick with your mouth before God. Ecclesiastes 5:2. This is not only about speaking to God, it's about learning to speak with wisdom. Because many times we speak without thinking. We promise without measuring. We react without reflecting. And then, consequences come. Let me ask you something very direct. How many decisions have you made impulsively and later regretted? We've all done it. But this is where the message becomes practical. The preacher invites us to pause, to think before acting, to reflect before deciding, to listen before speaking. That's why another passage says, the heart of the wise makes their speech judicious. Proverbs 16:23. It's not about speaking less. It's about speaking better, because your words can heal or hurt, encourage or discourage, bring people closer or push them away. And the same is true with your decisions. Every choice you make builds the path you walk. And here's something important. Not all decisions carry the same weight. Some are small and others change the entire direction of your life. That's why the preacher began to value something many people underestimate: practical wisdom. Not just knowing, but applying. Not just understanding, but living accordingly. And this led him to a powerful conclusion. Wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. Ecclesiastes 7:19. In other words, one good decision can have more impact than great strength or many resources. Now I want you to think about this. If you changed the way you speak and the way you make decisions, how would your life change? Because you don't need to change everything at once. Sometimes small adjustments create big transformations. And when the preacher began to live with that awareness, his perspective became even clearer. He began to understand something many people ignore: that life is not only about what you do or decide, but also about how you respond to what you cannot control. And that is key. Now we come to something everyone faces, whether you want to or not. The things you cannot control, because you can organize your life, plan, and work hard. But there will always be situations that escape your control. Unexpected changes, difficult moments, answers that never come. And this is where many people lose their peace, not because of what they do, but because of how they react to what they cannot change. The preacher in Ecclesiastes understood this as he carefully observed life. The race is not to the swift or the battle to the strong, but time and chance happen to them all. Ecclesiastes 9:11. This challenges an idea many people have, that everything depends only on effort. Yes, effort matters, but it's not everything. There are moments, circumstances, opportunities that you cannot control. And then the question arises: what do you do when things don't go as expected? This is where the message becomes deeply practical, because you cannot control everything that happens, but you can choose how to respond. That's why another passage reminds us, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, present your requests to God, and the peace of God will guard your hearts. Philippians 4:6-7. It doesn't say everything will be solved immediately. It says you can find peace, even in the middle of uncertainty. And that changes everything. Let me ask you something honestly. When something doesn't go your way, do you fill yourself with anxiety? Or do you seek God? Because that's where the difference lies. Many people live reacting with constant worry, but the preacher began to understand that there is another way to live. A way that is more stable, more peaceful, more trusting. Not because everything is under control, but because not everything depends on you. And that even if it doesn't seem like it, is a great relief, because it allows you to let go of what you cannot handle and focus on what you can do. Now, when you begin to live this way, something interesting happens. You stop obsessing over results and start focusing on purpose. And that leads you to a much more stable life. But there is still something more that the preacher discovered, something many people overlook, and that can completely change the way you face the future. I want you to pay very close attention to what comes next, because there is something here that can completely change the way you face the future. Fear. We don't always call it that, but it's there. Fear of failing, fear of losing, fear of not achieving what you expect, fear of what hasn't even happened yet, and that fear often paralyzes you. It makes you doubt. It makes you delay decisions. It makes you live with insecurity. The preacher in Ecclesiastes expressed it very clearly. Whoever watches the wind will not plant. Ecclesiastes 11:4. In other words, if you wait for perfect conditions, you will never move forward, because there will always be something that makes you hesitate. There will always be uncertainty. But here's an important truth. You don't need absolute certainty to move forward. You need faith. And faith is not ignoring reality. It's moving forward trusting God, even when you don't have all the answers. That's why the Bible also says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." 2 Corinthians 5:7. Now let me speak to you directly. How many things have you stopped yourself from doing because of fear, or even worse? How many important decisions have you postponed waiting for the perfect moment? That moment often never comes. And while you wait, time keeps passing. That's why the preacher invites us to act. Sow your seed in the morning, and at evening, let your hands not be idle. Ecclesiastes 11:6. Do what is yours to do, take steps, move forward. Even if you don't have everything figured out, and if what you're hearing is helping you, if it's making you reflect, pause, or see your life differently, take a moment to subscribe, not just for content, but for guidance, for reminders that bring you back to what truly matters. Now let's return to what truly matters. Because when the preacher understood that he should not be ruled by fear, he began to live with more freedom, with more determination, with more purpose. And that led him to discover something even deeper, that life is not only about starting well, but about finishing well. And that requires something many people overlook. Now I want us to think about something that almost no one considers, but that changes everything. How you finish matters more than how you start. We live in a culture that celebrates beginnings, new projects, new goals, new opportunities. But the preacher in Ecclesiastes saw something different, and he expressed it like this: "The end of a matter is better than its beginning, and patience is better than pride." Ecclesiastes 7:8. It's a powerful idea, because many start with enthusiasm, but not everyone perseveres. And here I want to speak to you honestly. It's not just about starting well, it's about staying firm when things become difficult, because that's where many people stop. When problems come, when obstacles appear, when things don't go as expected. But that is exactly where character is formed, where faith is strengthened, where the true direction of your life is defined. That's why another passage says, "The one who stands firm to the end will be saved." Matthew 24:13. Not the one who starts with excitement, but the one who remains. And let me ask you something very directly. Are you willing to keep going, even when it's not easy? Because it's easy to move forward when everything is going well. But real growth happens when you choose to continue, despite everything. The preacher understood that patience is not weakness, it is strength. That's why he also said, "Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools." Ecclesiastes 7:9. In other words, don't react impulsively. Don't quit out of frustration. Don't make decisions based on temporary emotions. Learn to hold steady, to remain firm, to move forward with wisdom. And here's something I want you to take with you. Life is not defined by a single moment. It is built day by day, decision by decision, attitude by attitude. And when you begin to live with that mindset, something changes within you. You stop chasing quick result and start building something lasting. But there is still something more that the preacher discovered, something that can completely change the way you look at your own mistakes. Because yes, there is room for that too. And understanding it correctly can free you far more than you imagine. Now I want to talk to you about something very personal, your mistakes. Yes, those moments you wish you could erase, decisions that didn't turn out well, words you shouldn't have said, paths you shouldn't have taken. We all have them. The problem is not making mistakes. The problem is not knowing what to do with them. The preacher in Ecclesiastes understood something very important about human nature. There is no one on earth who is righteous, no one who does what is right and never sins. Ecclesiastes 7:20. It's an uncomfortable truth, but also a freeing one. No one is perfect, and accepting that changes everything. Because many people live carrying constant guilt. They replay the past. They judge themselves harshly. They get stuck in what they can no longer change, but here's something key. God does not want you to live trapped in your past. He wants you to learn and move forward. That's why another passage says, "Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy." Proverbs 28:13. It's not about ignoring what you did. It's about acknowledging it and transforming it. Let me ask you something very directly. Are you learning from your mistakes, or are you living trapped in them? Because there's a big difference. One helps you grow. The other holds you back. The preacher also understood that listening too much to what others say can affect you more than necessary. Do not pay attention to every word people say. Ecclesiastes 7:21. In other words, don't define yourself by what others say about you. Not by your past mistakes, not by isolated moments. Your story doesn't end there. And here I want to speak to you clearly. God does not see you only for what you've done. He sees you for what you can become. And that changes everything, because it gives you hope. It gives you direction. It gives you a new opportunity. And when the preacher began to understand this, he stopped focusing on perfection and began focusing on wisdom, on learning, on growing, on moving forward with intention. And that led him to a very important conclusion, that life is not about avoiding every mistake, but about learning to live wisely in the middle of them. And there is still something essential left to understand, something that brings everything together. Now I want you to focus carefully on what I'm about to say, because this is where many people get confused. They try to live well, make good decisions, avoid mistakes, but they forget something fundamental. Wisdom is not just knowing what is right, it is living connected to the right source. Now I want you to focus carefully on what I'm about to say, because this is where many people get confused. They try to live well, make good decisions, avoid mistakes, but they forget something fundamental. Wisdom is not just knowing what is right, it is living connected to the right source, understanding that there is someone greater than you, who sees beyond, who sustains what you cannot control. And here, I want to speak to you very clearly. You can try to build your life on your own. You can rely only on your strength. You can depend only on your logic, but sooner or later that falls short. Because there are things reason cannot explain. There are moments strength cannot sustain. There are situations that go beyond any plan. And that's when you need something more. Or rather, someone more. The preacher began to understand that true stability is not found in what you have, nor in what you know, but in who you are connected to. That's why it is also said, "Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord. They will be like a tree planted by the water." Jeremiah 17:7-8. Firm, stable, deeply rooted, not because everything is easy, but because it is well sustained. Let me ask you something very personal. Where are you placing your trust today? In what changes? Or in what remains? Because that decision defines far more than you imagine. And when the preacher understood this, his perspective became completely clear. He stopped searching everywhere and began to center his life on what truly matters. And that led him to the final stretch of his reflection, where everything comes together, where everything makes sense. Now we are reaching a key point. Everything we've talked about so far begins to come together here. Because the preacher in Ecclesiastes didn't just want to analyze life, he wanted to leave a clear conclusion, something that doesn't depend on circumstances, something that doesn't change with time, something solid. And to get there, he first understood something very important. Life is short, shorter than we think. That's why he wrote, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth." Ecclesiastes 12:1. It doesn't say when you have time. It doesn't say when everything is resolved. It says now, because many people postpone what matters most. They say, later I'll seek God. Later I'll change. Later I'll focus on the spiritual. But that later often never comes. And here I want to speak to you very clearly. You don't need to have everything figured out to come closer to God. You need to decide to do it now, because every day that passes is an opportunity that doesn't come back. The preacher understood this when he described how life moves forward and how time does not stop. That's why another passage also reminds us, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. 2 Corinthians 6:2. Now, not tomorrow, not when everything is perfect. Now. Let me ask you something very directly. If you already know what matters, why keep postponing it? Because many times it's not a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of decision. And this is where everything becomes very personal, because no one can make that decision for you. Not your friends, not your family, no one else, only you. The preacher came to understand that life is not about accumulating years, but about living with purpose starting today. And that led him to the final conclusion, a conclusion that sums up everything we've talked about. And when you hear it, you'll understand why everything before it matters. Because it's not just another idea, it is the center of everything. We've reached the final point, and I want you to pause here with me, without rushing. Because everything we've talked about, everything you've heard, everything you've reflected on, is summed up in this. The preacher in the book of Ecclesiastes, after analyzing life from every angle, after trying everything, after questioning everything, came to a clear, firm, final conclusion. The conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Ecclesiastes 12:13. This is everything. It's not complicated, it's not unreachable, but it is profound. Because it means that the meaning of life is not found in what you accumulate, nor in what you achieve, nor in what others think about you. It is found in your relationship with God. And here I want to speak to you directly as if this were the final part of our conversation. Maybe you've been searching for answers. Maybe you've tried many things. Maybe you've felt that emptiness we talked about at the beginning. And now you understand something. You don't need to keep searching everywhere. You need to return to the center, to God, because that's where everything makes sense. That's why we are also reminded, but seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. Matthew 6:33. First, not later, not as a last option. First. And when you do that, everything else begins to fall into place. Not because life becomes perfect, but because your inner life finds stability, peace, direction, purpose. And before we finish, let me ask you something simple. If this message reached you at the right moment, if it made you reflect, pause, or even confront something inside you, subscribe to the channel. Because growth is not a one-time moment. It's a process. And sometimes having the right voice along the way makes all the difference. Now I want to leave you with one final question. Not to answer me, but to answer yourself. What are you going to do with everything you've just heard? Because understanding it is important, but living it changes everything.